My parents abandoned my 6-year-old son just because I refused to lend my younger brother $30. I still remember the heat in my chest the moment I got that call. I was in the middle of reviewing a client's retirement portfolio laptop open coffee, gone cold when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was a priest, a man named Father Joshua. He said he believed he had my son Noah, sitting quietly in his office with a backpack, a water bottle, and a note that said I had abandoned him. My mind went completely still. I didn't understand. I hadn't spoken to my parents in over a week. I hadn't authorized anyone to pick up Noah from school. And yet here I was trying to process the words, "Your parents dropped him off here and told us you weren't in a position to care for him." That was the moment everything I thought I knew about loyalty, trust, and blood family crumbled. My name is Salis Rose. I'm 33 years old. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and I work as an independent financial consultant. It's a job I built from scratch, after my husband Michael died 2 years ago in a car accident that should have never happened. He was driving back from his sister's place in broad daylight when a drunk driver ran a red light and ended it all in less than 5 seconds. At the time, our son Noah was barely 4, he'd just started preschool. He still had that soft, sleepy baby voice and thought dinosaurs might come back someday. After Michael died, my world went dark. But I kept moving. I had to, because Noah didn't just lose a father. He needed a mother who wouldn't fall apart on him. My parents, Linda and Richard, had always been what people politely call traditional. My younger brother, Carlos, on the other hand, had been treated like the family jewel since the day he was born. Growing up, I was the one who followed the rules, got straight A's, skipped parties, and landed internships early. Carlos got a DUI at 19, and they bought him a new car the following week. I graduated top of my class in finance and paid off my student loans before 30. Carlos dropped out of business school twice, and somehow still got a loan co-signed by our dad for entrepreneurial freedom. They said he needed support. They said I was self-sufficient. "Salis, you've always been the strong one. Carlos just needs a little more time." That line followed me into adulthood like a bad shadow. After Michael passed, I stayed quiet. I didn't have the energy to debate family dynamics while learning how to be a single mother and run a growing client base from home. I took the babysitting help they occasionally offered, said thank you at holidays, and smiled when my mother called Carlos a visionary. I didn't trust them completely, but I never thought they'd do something like this. Not to Noah. It all started unraveling 3 weeks before the church incident. Carlos showed up at my place on a Thursday afternoon unannounced. He had that overconfident bounce in his step, the one he always had right before asking for something. Noah was in the other room coloring while I cleared client notes off the kitchen table. Carlos launched into this pitch about a chain of holographic dining experiences he was building. Tables with digital projectors, AI-generated food aesthetics. He called it the future of fine dining. I listened politely for 20 minutes before he got to the ask. He needed $30,000 to get into the investor circle. He called it a bridge round. He promised triple returns in 6 months guaranteed. I told him I'd think about it, then spent that night digging into the project and the people backing it. What I found wasn't just sketchy, it was manipulative. The entire investment structure was modeled like a pyramid, with new visionaries earning commissions for every family member or friend they brought in. It had every red flag of a white-collar scam dressed up in startup vocabulary. I called Carlos the next morning and told him I couldn't support it. Not financially, not ethically. I said I was willing to sit down with him and help him structure something legitimate if he really wanted to pursue the restaurant industry, but I wouldn't give him money for something that could harm others, including our parents. He didn't take it well. He hung up, texted me 5 times in all caps calling me selfish, then disappeared. I assumed that was the end of it. I had no idea he'd go to our parents. I had no idea they'd believe him. Or worse, that they'd already given him money, and now needed a scapegoat to cover the cracks. I didn't know any of this when I got that call from the church. I only knew that my 6-year-old had been left alone on church steps by the only people I ever trusted enough to keep him safe. You'd think that would be the lowest point. That nothing could feel worse than walking into a parish office and seeing your child sipping lukewarm cocoa while a priest hands you a note that says you failed him. But what happened next would make that moment feel like a warm-up. Because when I asked my parents why they did it, their answer wasn't regret. It was punishment. I didn't scream. I didn't even cry. I took Noah home, made him grilled cheese like nothing had happened, and stayed up all night watching him breathe. He fell asleep clinging to my arm, whispering that he'd been a good boy, asking if I'd leave him too. I told him no, over and over. I told him I would never do that, no matter how angry, no matter how tired, no matter how much pressure I was under. I watched the rise and fall of his chest until dawn, then emailed my clients to reschedule every meeting I had that week. Whatever fire they were dealing with, it could wait. Mine was breathing in the other room, holding onto a stuffed shark and checking the hallway every time the floor creaked. The next morning I called my mother. No answer. Then my father. Straight to voicemail. Carlos's number had already blocked me, or maybe he'd changed it. Either way, there was no getting through. I called Noah's school to file a revised pickup authorization form removing every name but my own and his pediatrician's. I asked the front office if they had any security footage from that day. They told me there was none, but the teacher on duty remembered my father saying there was a family emergency and that I was in the hospital. The lie was calculated. Specific enough to pass, vague enough to avoid suspicion. That afternoon I filed a police report, not because I thought my parents would be arrested right away, but because I needed it on record. I needed someone outside my family to acknowledge that what had happened was not a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mix-up or a lapse in judgment. It was abandonment, and it had traumatized my child. Detective Grant took the report. He was calm, neutral, and asked the right questions. When I told him my family had dropped Noah off at a church without my knowledge, he raised his eyebrows but didn't flinch. When I said they did it because I refused to give my brother $30,000, his pen froze mid-sentence. He looked up slowly and said, "Did they tell your son why they were leaving him?" I nodded. They told him I chose money over family. He wrote that down carefully, then underlined it. By the end of that week I had hired a lawyer. Renee, my best friend and also a brilliant estate planning attorney, referred me to someone she trusted. Her name was Jordan Vega. Calm, razor sharp, no nonsense. She listened to my story without interrupting, then said plainly, "This isn't just about custody or trust. This is child endangerment. Do you want to press charges?" I hesitated. Not because I didn't think they deserved consequences, but because I wasn't sure if I was ready to become that kind of daughter. The kind that sues her own parents. I asked if we could start by sending a formal no-contact order regarding Noah. Jordan agreed. She said she'd draft the paperwork and start building a case in parallel in case we wanted to escalate later. I thanked her, though the words felt small compared to the weight she had just lifted from my chest. Noah started having night terrors the following weekend. He'd wake up screaming, begging me not to leave. He stopped playing with the neighbors' kids and refused to go anywhere without me. I scheduled sessions with a child therapist, someone Jordan had worked with on similar cases. Her name was Dr. Harlow. She was warm and soft-spoken with a kind smile that didn't feel performative. After the first 2 sessions, she pulled me aside and said, "He's confused, not broken. That's the good news. But this isn't going to go away unless we give him back a sense of control." I asked what that looked like. She said boundaries, stability, repetition, and truth in doses he could process. So I told Noah the truth. Not all of it, but enough. I said Grandma and Grandpa were very upset with Mommy and made a very bad choice. I told him it wasn't his fault, that he didn't do anything wrong, that I would never let anyone take him without asking again. He didn't cry. He just nodded, then asked if his shark could sleep in our bed for a while. I said yes. I thought that would be the end of it, at least for a while. But the following Monday, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a printed copy of a group message thread between my parents Carlos and 2 of our cousins. In it I was called unstable, dangerous, self-righteous. Carlos said I was weaponizing motherhood and punishing the family just because I have a God complex. My mother had written she always wanted to feel superior. Let her see what it's like to be alone. At the bottom was a sticky note. No signature, just the words, "Family protects family, unless that family is Salis." That night I changed every password I had. I upgraded the home security system. I installed a camera outside Noah's school. I made an emergency backup plan with Renee in case anything else happened. I wasn't just up against resentment now, I was up against a narrative. One where I had somehow become the villain, the ungrateful daughter, the bitter widow, the selfish sister. But what they didn't realize was that their silence was a gift. Their smear campaign only made my decision easier. I didn't have to wonder if I was overreacting. I didn't have to guess where I stood. They made it clear. And clarity is power. I never expected sympathy, but I also didn't expect silence, the kind that spreads like smoke thick and choking from people who once sent birthday cards and family group texts full of emojis. Within a week of the church incident, I'd been quietly erased. Cousins stopped responding. My aunt, who used to share old recipes, unfriended me online. Even family friends who had known me since childhood simply vanished. No one called to ask if Noah was okay. No one asked if I was. But the gossip traveled without friction. A neighbor who always waved suddenly looked away when I walked past her yard. At the grocery store, I overheard two women whispering near the produce aisle. One of them said, "She really let her grief get to her. I heard she's unstable," the other replied. "And selfish. After everything her parents did for her." I didn't say a word. I just picked up a carton of blueberries and walked away. But that night I sat in the shower long after the water turned cold, trying to understand how protecting my son made me the villain in their story. It wasn't just personal anymore, it was reputational. Clients started canceling meetings. One said she felt uncomfortable mixing family drama with financial planning. Another ghosted me entirely after a long-standing contract renewal discussion. I kept my composure on the outside, but the business I had built so carefully after Michael died was starting to feel like it was cracking at the foundation. I told myself to hold steady. It would pass. But part of me knew it wouldn't pass unless I faced the truth. Not just the truth about my parents, about Carlos. The first clue came when I reviewed the screenshots from the anonymous packet someone had slipped under my door. I didn't know who sent it. There was no return address, just a slim envelope tucked into my front gate mailbox. Inside were three things: a group chat printout, a screenshot of a crypto pitch deck with Carlos's name on it, and a payment structure chart labeled Investor Tiers. At first glance, it looked like typical startup enthusiasm. But then I noticed the language. Minimum recruitment threshold. Tiered payout commission. Top referrer bonus. These weren't investor benefits. These were pyramid bonuses. And Carlos wasn't just a hopeful participant. He was listed as a regional strategist. I searched the term, followed a digital breadcrumb trail through LinkedIn accounts and pitch videos posted on obscure websites, and eventually landed on a closed online forum. There I found threads from people trying to get their money back from the same so-called investment Carlos had tried to rope me into. One of them had even named him directly. Said he'd promised a triple return in 60 days and ghosted them after payment. I forwarded everything to Jordan. She didn't say much, just asked for time to verify. 3 days later, she called and told me Carlos's involvement wasn't just unwise, it was criminal. The SEC had issued a warning about the investment scheme 6 weeks prior. The founders were under investigation for securities fraud. She asked me if I'd be willing to talk to federal agents. I said yes. That weekend, Agent Liddell from the Financial Crimes Unit met me at my office. He was polite, methodical, and direct. He asked how I knew Carlos, how he pitched the investment, and whether he had disclosed where the money was going. I explained the whole thing. From the day he showed up in my kitchen with a fake smile and a glossy deck to the moment he told me I'd regret not helping him, Agent Liddell took notes without judgment. When I asked him whether my parents' mortgage could be traced to the scheme, he nodded and said, "We're looking into it. You're not the only family caught in this." I don't know why that hit so hard. Maybe because for the first time I realized my story wasn't isolated, that other people, other families were being hollowed out from the inside by someone like my brother. The next blow came from the mortgage company. I hadn't even asked, but the records were public. Renee helped me dig. My parents had taken out a second mortgage on their house for $120,000. The disbursement lined up exactly 1 week before Carlos pitched me. It wasn't just a desperate decision, it was a coordinated one. My parents knew what he was doing. Maybe they didn't understand the mechanics. Maybe they believed in his delusions. But they still chose to enable him, then punished me for refusing to play along. At that point, something inside me shifted. I'd spent weeks spinning in anxiety trying to keep Noah grounded, keep the business alive, keep myself sane. But I couldn't keep orbiting around the question of what I owed people who had shown no hesitation in sacrificing my son's safety to protect their favorite child's fantasy. I wasn't angry, I was clear. I began drafting something with Jordan and Dr. Harlow's help. A framework, terms, not revenge, boundaries. If they wanted to be in Noah's life again, even in the distant future, they would need to meet every part of that framework. Because this time, I wasn't negotiating as a daughter trying to be understood. I was a mother protecting her child. And that changed everything. It didn't happen in one grand moment. There was no dramatic confrontation or shouting match that cleared the air. The shift came quietly, like how dawn replaces night. One morning I sat across from Dr. Harlow after Noah's session, watching him build something out of Legos in the waiting area. He was calmer now. Still wary, still attached to routines, but he had stopped asking if Grandma was coming back. That silence used to scare me. Now it gave me space to breathe. I turned to Dr. Harlow and asked a question I'd been avoiding for weeks. What happens if they come back, not for him, but for help? She studied me carefully before responding. You set conditions. Not for punishment. For protection. For accountability. That night I opened a blank document and titled it plainly, Terms of Reentry. I knew my parents wouldn't accept it. Not right away. But writing it helped me think clearly for the first time in weeks. I wasn't trying to rebuild a broken family. I was defining what safety looked like for my son. No unsupervised visits, no contact without therapy, no manipulation masked as love. I sent the document to Jordan. She tightened the language, added legal clarity, and suggested I include a restorative therapy clause. They'll scoff at this, I said. Probably, she replied. But it draws the line. And lines protect. A week later, I received a text from my father for the first time since the incident. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a question. It said, "We need to talk. Your mother is not well. We can't afford rent." I stared at it for a long time. There was no mention of Noah, no recognition of what they'd done, just need. I didn't reply. I forwarded the message to Jordan. She suggested we use it as an opening for a facilitated conversation. Not in my home, not even alone. A controlled space. Neutral, but safe. Her office offered exactly that. We set a date. Jordan brought in a colleague who specialized in family mediation. I informed Dr. Harlow, and she offered to be on standby in case we needed clarification on Noah's progress. I wasn't afraid of facing them. I was afraid they would twist it again, reframe the story, until I was the cold-hearted daughter refusing to help aging parents. But by this point, enough had happened that I no longer cared how I appeared to them. I wasn't walking in as a child seeking approval. I was a mother protecting her son. They arrived 10 minutes late. My mother looked thinner than I remembered, her makeup done but uneven. My father was in the same jacket he always wore to Sunday church, even though it was a Wednesday. Carlos came too uninvited. He walked in with that same air of bravado, trying to fill the room before anyone else could speak. Jordan greeted them politely, offered coffee, and asked them to sit. I stayed silent until everyone had settled. Then I opened my laptop, turned it around, and showed them what I had discovered. Screenshots, emails, the payment tiers, Carlos's recruitment role, a message where he bragged about getting our parents to refinance the house. Their eyes scanned the screen. My father looked confused, then angry. My mother's expression cracked somewhere between shame and disbelief. Carlos didn't say a word. Not at first. Then quietly he muttered, "That wasn't supposed to be seen. It's out of context." I looked at him calmly and said, "There is no context where using your parents' savings to bankroll a scam is excusable, especially when you knew." My mother started to cry. Not loudly, just quiet broken breathing as she reached for a tissue. My father folded his arms and said, "We were trying to help him. You never gave him a chance," Jordan interjected. Helping someone is not the same as enabling them, and abandoning a child is not help. It's harm. I passed them the printed terms of reentry. My voice didn't waver. These are the only conditions under which I will allow further contact with Noah. No exceptions, no compromises. Carlos scoffed. You act like you're some saint, like you've never made mistakes. I didn't flinch. You're right, I've made plenty. But I've never endangered a child to protect an illusion. He stood up and started pacing, muttering about betrayal, about loyalty. Jordan calmly asked him to leave if he couldn't remain respectful. He left without another word, slamming the door behind him. My parents remained. They didn't sign anything that day, but my mother held the papers in her lap, staring at the sentence that said healing is possible, but only if safety comes first. She asked if she could call Noah. I shook my head. Not yet. Not until he's ready. And not until you've done the work. My father opened his mouth, but this time he said nothing. He simply nodded once slowly, and reached for his wife's hand. That evening, I sat on the edge of Noah's bed watching him flip through his picture book. He didn't ask about Grandma. He didn't ask about Grandpa. He asked if we could get ice cream on Friday, and whether sharks could jump like dolphins. I said yes to the first and maybe to the second. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next blow. Because I had drawn the line, and this time I wouldn't let them cross it. The silence after that meeting lasted longer than I expected. 2 weeks passed without a word. No calls, no emails, not even a vague message through extended family. For a moment I wondered if they had decided to disappear altogether to let the shame bury them before accountability could. But the next message didn't come from my parents. It came from the Federal Investigation Unit. Agent Liddell contacted me again with a brief update. The SEC and the FBI had officially opened parallel cases against the fraudulent investment network. Several of the scheme's top recruiters had already been indicted. One of the names under scrutiny was Carlos Rose. I asked him plainly, "Is he going to prison?" Liddell replied, "That depends. If he cooperates early, provides intel, and admits to recruitment activity, there may be a plea deal. Otherwise, yes, prison is likely." I thanked him, closed the call, and just sat there for a while. There was no satisfaction in hearing it, only exhaustion. Because the truth was Carlos had dragged half our family into something that wasn't just legally toxic, it was emotionally corrosive, and now the price was coming due. 3 days later, Carlos showed up at my door. I only opened it because Noah wasn't home. Renee had taken him to a science museum for the afternoon. Carlos looked thinner, his shirt untucked, and there was a tiredness in his face I hadn't seen before. Not shame exactly, but the weight of something he could no longer control. I stepped onto the porch and shut the door behind me so he couldn't see inside. He didn't speak right away, just stared down at the railing, then said, "You were right." "About all of it." I didn't respond. He added, "I didn't know it would go this far. I thought I was just hustling. Like Dad always said, find the angle, chase the win." I kept my voice calm. "You used our parents. You tried to use me. You left my child emotionally wrecked. That's not hustling, Carlos. That's harm." He nodded slowly. "I know. That's why I'm here. They offered me a deal. Treatment instead of time. But I have to complete a full financial restitution plan and enter rehab for gambling." I told them I'd do it. I folded my arms. "And what do you want from me?" He exhaled. "Nothing. I just thought you should know that I'm not hiding, and that I'm sorry." It wasn't the apology I would have asked for, but it was the closest he had ever come to admitting fault. I said, "I hope you mean it. For your own sake. But don't expect Noah to trust you again just because you say you're sorry." His shoulders dropped. "I don't. I just hope. One day." I didn't answer. I watched him walk back to his car slowly, with none of the bravado he used to wear like a jacket. A week later, I got a letter from my parents, handwritten. My mother's familiar cursive filled 3 pages. It wasn't an apology either. Not directly. But it was more honest than anything I'd received from them in years. She wrote about fear, about pride, about how watching her son drown in dreams while her daughter pulled away made her feel like she'd failed both of us. She didn't excuse what they did, She didn't ask to see Noah. She just said, "If you ever want to talk again, I will listen without defense." I didn't cry when I read it, but I did read it 3 times. Then I folded it and tucked it into a drawer I labeled maybe. Noah, meanwhile, began smiling more. He asked to sleep alone again. He started drawing pictures with happy endings. One showed a big house with people inside, and a line outside with the words, "Only nice ones come in." Dr. Harlow smiled when I showed her. "He's setting boundaries in his own way," she said, "and feeling safe enough to enforce them." That same week he asked if we could have a dinner party. He wanted to invite Renee and her wife, plus Aunt Gloria and Dr. Harlow. "That's our family now, right?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes, baby. That's exactly what family means." We didn't host a dramatic celebration or throw out old memories. I didn't erase my last name or burn childhood photos. What I did was choose. Quietly, steadily. I chose peace over performance. I chose safety over silence. I chose Noah over nostalgia. I didn't need my parents to grovel. I didn't need Carlos to be redeemed. I just needed my home to be safe again. And I had made it that. The next step came without ceremony. Noah's birthday. He turned 7, surrounded by people who had shown up in the worst moments without asking for anything in return. Renee made a cake shaped like a rocket. Aunt Gloria brought a second-hand telescope and told him he could use it to see people's true selves. Dr. Harlow gave him a book about brave kids and gently smiled from the corner. My parents didn't come. They didn't ask to. But they mailed a simple card. No guilt. No explanation. Just happy birthday. Love Grandma and Grandpa. Noah held it in his hand for a long time, then quietly said, "Maybe they're learning." I didn't answer. Some lessons take time. Some don't come at all. But I'd finally learned mine. And I wasn't going to unlearn it just because the people who hurt us were now hurting too. A few months later, I quietly filed a legal motion to separate my name from the remaining joint financial accounts that still had legacy links to my parents. It wasn't about drama or revenge. It was about cleaning house. About making sure Noah's future would be protected regardless of what came next in the fallout from Carlos's trial. At that point, the news had started covering the investigation. A few finance blogs even published short exposés, naming Carlos as one of several family network recruiters in a now exposed multi-million-dollar crypto pyramid scheme. He wasn't arrested, but he was subpoenaed to testify under oath. That would live on public record forever. My parents, who had once spoken of building legacy, were now mostly quiet. Aunt Gloria told me they were selling off assets and living simply now, trying to pay off debts that should have never been theirs in the first place. I didn't feel sorry for them, but I also didn't hate them. I had spent so many years waiting for closure that I didn't realize I had already built it myself. Not with a letter, not with an apology, but with boundaries, earned peace, and quiet progress. One afternoon, while Noah was at soccer practice, I sat alone in the studio and flipped through old sketchbooks from my early years. Some of them still had little notes from my mother back when she used to encourage my creativity. Before money, pride, and ego changed the tone of our family, it struck me then not as nostalgia but as a strange kind of grief, not for the people they became but for the people they might have been. I closed the sketchbook, made myself tea, and let that thought pass without judgment. Because healing wasn't about rewriting what happened. It was about holding the truth without letting it define your joy. That spring, my work was selected to be part of a citywide art exhibit featuring women-led design studios. The theme was resilient spaces. One of my featured pieces was a room layout based on Noah's bedroom titled Sanctuary for the Soft-Spoken. It was filled with warm wood, natural light, soft curves, and soundproofing layers designed for sensitive children. On opening night, a local journalist asked me what inspired the space. I answered honestly, this room is for my son and for the version of me who needed a room like this growing up but never had one. The story ran online 2 days later, and the headline read, "From Rejection to Reinvention, Architect Builds Healing One Room at a Time." I didn't post it to my family group chat. There wasn't one anymore. But Renee framed it and hung it in the kitchen right above Noah's cereal shelf. Noah read the article too. He was 7, but emotionally sharp in ways most adults weren't. One night, he asked me, "Why did they stop loving us?" I didn't pretend. I told him. Sometimes people confuse love with control. And when they lose control, they act like they've lost love. But that's not real love, Noah. Real love stays, even when you say no. He nodded slowly. So the people who stayed, they're the ones who love us, I smiled. Yes, baby. That's exactly it. He went back to building his model airplane, and I sat quietly beside him, knowing that this was what real legacy looked like. Not money, not status. Just this clarity connection, and one more safe night at home. As summer came, we took a trip to the coast. Just me, Noah, Renee, and her wife Lana. It wasn't extravagant, just a simple cabin by the beach, with quiet mornings and long walks. On the last evening, Noah ran up to me barefoot and sandy, holding a shell. Look, Mama. It's got cracks, but it's still shiny inside. I looked at it carefully, then nodded. Just like us. He beamed. Exactly. That night, as he slept, curled up with the shell next to his pillow, I watched the tide go out from the porch, and thought about how many years I spent chasing approval from people who only saw me as a tool. That part of my life was over, not erased, just behind me. Carlos eventually completed his restitution program. Last I heard, he moved to Austin and was working in tech support for a startup. I didn't follow him. I didn't block him either. I just let him go. As for my parents, they tried to send holiday cards again the following December. Simple generic ones. No long notes, no guilt, just their names. I didn't respond. Not out of bitterness, but because not every story deserves a sequel. Sometimes, the most powerful act of love is silence. Sometimes the clearest kind of justice is living better without an audience. This isn't a revenge story, it's a clarity story. About how walking away with your child, your sanity, and your soul intact is more radical than any act of retaliation. I didn't need to fight them. I just needed to stop explaining myself. I didn't need them to see my worth. I needed to believe it first. And I do now. Every day, every quiet morning, every time Noah laughs without flinching. That's the real win. A few weeks after the beach trip, I got an unexpected message in my studio's inbox. It was from a local university's architecture department, inviting me to speak to a group of design students about emotional spaces and ethical client relationships. I nearly deleted it, not out of disrespect, but because the idea of speaking about something so personal in an academic setting made me nervous. But Renee nudged me. Your story isn't just about the pain, she said. It's about what you built after. I agreed to speak. The lecture wasn't grand or rehearsed. I simply shared how building a home for someone isn't just about structure, it's about listening. About designing spaces that don't just look beautiful but feel safe. One student asked if I believed forgiveness was necessary to move on. I paused. Forgiveness is overrated when it's forced, I said. Clarity is more powerful. Boundaries are more lasting. A few students nodded. One even cried. After the session, a faculty member thanked me for being honest. I walked home quietly, not proud, not shaken, just still. Around that time, Noah's school held a family day. I remember that morning clearly because it rained, and he insisted on wearing his rocket hoodie, even though it was too small. As we walked into the classroom, another child pointed and whispered, "Is that your dad?" Noah laughed and said, "No, that's my mom. She's both." I smiled, but inside something clenched and loosened at the same time. For years I had tried to make up for what Noah didn't have, but he never saw it as lack. He just saw what was there, and called it love. That's the thing with children. They mirror what they receive. And I had stopped giving him confusion. I had started giving him presence. Later that evening, I found a letter tucked into his backpack. It was from his teacher. She said Noah had been nominated for a local kindness award by his classmates because he always helps others feel welcome and makes quiet kids feel seen. I cried. Not because of the award, but because I knew where that came from. From every hard day we made gentle. From every "I see you" I gave him when I had no one saying it to me. He had turned what we survived into something gentle for others. That was legacy. One night, while putting him to bed, he asked if he could keep using the nightlight even though he wasn't scared anymore. I said of course. He whispered, It just feels nice, knowing it's there. I understood completely. We all need something steady, something quiet and soft that says, "You're safe now." For some, it's a person, for others, a place. For me, it became the life I chose to build after everyone walked out. The life with fewer voices but more truth. Fewer expectations but deeper meaning. Months passed like that. No dramatic callbacks from my parents. No surprise apologies. Just quiet absence, which honestly felt cleaner than their noise ever did. I didn't check up on Carlos either. Some stories don't deserve updates. At work, my team grew slowly. We hired 2 interns, both women who had been overlooked in their previous offices. I taught them not just the craft but the ethics. That no deadline is more important than a team member's mental health. That no client is worth selling your soul to. They called me firm but fair. I took it as the highest compliment. One afternoon, Renee and I were reviewing project files when she looked up and asked, "Do you ever think they'll try again?" Reach out for real, I thought about it. About the years, I waited for that door to knock, for that email to land. And then I said the truth. Maybe. But it won't matter. Because I won't be waiting anymore. She smiled, nodded, and went back to her screen. That moment wasn't cinematic. It was quiet. But in that quiet, I realized something had ended for good. And not because someone else closed the door, but because I locked it myself from the inside and walked forward. This wasn't a story about revenge. It wasn't even a story about abandonment. It was about choice. About choosing clarity over chaos. Choosing to be the person I needed when I was hurting. Choosing to raise a son who would never have to question if he was enough. I used to think I needed to win something to prove my worth. But the real win was walking away without bitterness. Building a life that didn't depend on their validation. And turning my quiet pain into something that could hold others gently. A few months after that trip, life no longer felt like something I was surviving through. It just felt like life, simple and steady. One Saturday morning, I sat by the window in my small kitchen watching Noah eat cereal in mismatched pajamas. He had outgrown the ones with stars but refused to throw them out because they were lucky. He talked about a school project on family traditions and asked if we had one. I paused, caught off guard. Then I said, "We make space for each other. That's our tradition." He nodded like it made perfect sense and went back to crunching cereal. That moment stayed with me. It reminded me that legacy isn't always about what you pass down in your will. Sometimes it's the feeling someone carries long after you leave the room. Around that time, a client asked me to design a small healing studio in the mountains for women recovering from burnout. She said she chose me not for my portfolio but because she heard I listened deeply. I accepted the project quietly. I didn't post about it. I didn't try to prove anything. I just showed up, sketches in hand, and asked what safety looked like to her. We ended up creating a space with no mirrors, soft corners, and windows that faced nothing but trees. She cried when she saw it finished. Not from sadness, from recognition. That space reflected her healing, not her past. That became a turning point for me. I wasn't designing houses anymore. I was designing return spaces that welcomed people back to themselves. One afternoon, while organizing old boxes, I found a photo of my parents holding Noah at the hospital. They looked proud, even soft, for a moment. I stared at it for a while, wondering how people could hold something so pure and still choose ego over empathy. I didn't cry. I didn't burn it. I simply placed it in a file marked then. I wasn't angry anymore. But I had stopped rewriting the story in my head, hoping for a different ending. That was its own kind of peace. By the time Noah turned 7, he had stopped asking about Grandma and Grandpa, not because he forgot, but because he no longer needed a story that hurt to explain. When kids at school asked why he only had one parent, he just said, "Because my mom's enough." I used to think he would miss something crucial growing up without extended family. But he was growing up with something most kids didn't get: emotional clarity. That wasn't an accident, that was intentional. During a quiet winter evening, Renee and I hosted a small dinner with friends who had quietly become family. People who didn't ask invasive questions. People who helped fix sinks and showed up on snow days. I looked around and realized every face at that table had held me through some version of a storm. And yet we didn't need to talk about grief to feel connected. We just laughed, passed bread, and helped Noah glue cardboard rockets together for his school project. That night didn't feel like a milestone. It just felt true. And sometimes truth is more nourishing than closure. Sometime later, I got invited back to that university, where I had once spoken to design students. This time, they wanted me to mentor a thesis group. I almost said no, but something inside me said, "You've survived enough to help." The students weren't polished, but they had heart. One of them asked, "How do you know you've healed from something?" I didn't give them a quote or metaphor. I just said, "When it stops taking up space, you need for something better." They wrote it down like it meant something. Maybe it did. I didn't rebuild to prove I was right. I rebuilt because I refused to be defined by people who couldn't see past their own pride. I don't know if my parents ever talk about me now. I don't know if Carlos ever told the truth about what happened. What I do know is this: the silence they left me with became the cleanest canvas I ever had. And from that silence, I built something stable, even soft. Not out of spite, but out of steadiness. That was the real win. I once thought revenge looked like triumph. Headlines, recognition. Now I think it looks like walking into your own life without flinching. Like raising a child who knows peace without apology. Like going to bed and realizing you didn't chase or prove or beg all day. You just lived. That was enough. And some nights when the house is quiet and the stars are out, I think back to that girl who stood in front of her family and said number. She wasn't cold. She wasn't cruel. She was clear. And because of her, we're safe now. It was a regular Thursday afternoon when I got the message. An email, polite and brief, from a law firm in my hometown. Apparently, my parents had listed me as the secondary contact in a real estate document years ago, back when they still thought I might someday come around. The house had fallen into disrepair, taxes unpaid, and the firm was seeking advice on whether to foreclose or negotiate. For a second, I laughed. Not out of joy. More like the kind of sound you make when life circles back, holding a mirror and asking, "Still you?" I hadn't thought about that house in years, but I remembered every corner of it. Not because it was grand, but because it was loud with judgment, always cold in the mornings, even in summer. That house taught me how to read silence louder than shouting. I didn't respond right away. I let the email sit unopened for a week. Then one morning, while folding laundry, Noah asked if we ever had a house with a big tree in the front. I looked up. "We did," I said. "It wasn't ours for long." He shrugged and went back to coloring. But the question stayed with me, so I emailed the law firm back and asked for the current documents. I didn't want the house. I didn't want to save it. But I did want to understand why it had followed me years later like something unfinished. Turns out Carlos had tried to refinance it using a cosigner my parents never disclosed. When that failed, he just left, and they couldn't cover the payments on their own. The house sat there for almost a year. Empty, cracking, waiting. The irony didn't escape me. They had once screamed that I abandoned the family. But I had never left anything in that kind of ruin. I flew back once, quietly, no fanfare, just to see the house before it disappeared. From the outside, it looked smaller than I remembered. The tree Noah asked about was still there, somehow stronger than the structure it guarded. I didn't go in. I just stood across the street and looked at it for a long time. No tears, no nostalgia. Just a steady knowing that this place no longer held me. I had outgrown the version of me that once begged to be seen there. Back in Portland, I talked to a friend who did real estate development with a focus on repurposing old structures into community spaces. I asked him, "What happens when no one wants a house, but you don't want it to rot?" He said, "You let it change. You give it a new job." That stuck with me. I didn't want revenge. I wanted redemption. Not for them. For me. For every child who'd been taught that love was conditional. For every parent who never learned how to listen. So I bought the house. Quietly. Through a holding company. I didn't post about it. I didn't tell my parents. They'd long since stopped contacting me anyway. I hired a small team and turned it into a free transitional shelter for women with kids escaping family rejection. I made sure every room had warmth. I asked for windows that opened to trees, not fences. I told the architect to design a kitchen where no one had to ask permission to eat. That was the only rule. You deserve to be here just as you are. One day, a woman about my age sat with her daughter at the edge of the porch reading out loud from a second-hand book. She didn't know I was the owner. She just smiled and said I didn't think places like this existed. I said, they didn't, until someone needed them to. She nodded like she understood, and in that moment I felt something unhook in my chest. The kind of peace that doesn't come from being right, just from being free. I never told Noah the full story of that house, just that it found a better purpose. One day, he might ask why I bought it. Maybe I'll say, because healing sometimes starts in the places where pain began. Or maybe I'll just say, it felt right. That's the thing about quiet victories. They don't need applause, they just need to hold. The story didn't end when they cut me off. It began. And it kept unfolding every time I chose clarity over chaos, purpose over pride. I didn't win by fighting them. I won by stopping the pattern. By building something softer, truer, and stronger than the silence they left behind. People always assume the hardest part was walking away. But the truth is, walking away is just the beginning. The real work starts when no one's watching. When you're rebuilding a sense of self without applause, without backup, and sometimes without belief that any of it will matter. I didn't leave to prove a point. I left because I had a son who was learning how to measure love by what I allowed, and I refused to teach him that silence, guilt, or obligation counted as affection. In the years since, no one from that side of the family has called to ask about Noah. No apologies, no explanations, just distance and assumptions. I don't hold resentment anymore. There's no use setting a place at the table for people who never planned to eat with you in the first place. I used to wonder if they'd feel shame when they eventually found out what I'd done with the house, or how Noah grew up safe, kind, wildly curious, and nothing like the coldness they tried to mold him into. But I stopped waiting for that recognition. You don't need a witness to your healing for it to be real. These days, I work quietly. My HVAC business grew enough that I could step back, hire better people, and focus on designing programs for women leaving high-control families. Not everything is glamorous. Sometimes it's paperwork, sometimes it's arguing with inspectors about zoning permits. But I sleep well. And when I watch Noah hand a snack to someone without being asked or speak up in class with the kind of confidence I never had at his age, I know I didn't lose anything by saying no to people who couldn't love me unless I stayed small. Some nights, I think about my younger self, the version of me who cried in stairwells, wondering what she had done to be called selfish, lazy, ungrateful, just for asking to be treated with basic dignity. I don't pity her. I admire her, because she didn't give in. And she didn't let their version of her story become the truth. She held on long enough to become someone I'm proud to be. That matters more than closure, more than revenge. It matters because it's real. I've been asked if I'd ever reconnect with my parents or Carlos. Maybe. If there's honesty, if there's ownership, if the words come without demands or strings. But I'm not waiting for that either. Some people apologize with time. Others just disappear into the choices they made. Either way, I've moved forward without dragging their version of love behind me. What surprises me most isn't how everything turned out. It's how steady peace can feel when it's built from truth, not performance. I never got the dramatic moment where I stood in front of them and laid everything out. There was no viral scene, no public clapback, just years of consistent action, quiet decisions, and a refusal to hand over my future for temporary approval. The last time I drove past the shelter, it was a rainy Tuesday. One of the residents had hung a small wind chime on the porch. It was soft, barely audible, but I heard it from the street. That sound stayed with me all the way home. Not because it was loud, but because it was honest. Like healing, like forgiveness, like choosing yourself in a world that doesn't always reward it. You can come from rejection and still build something whole. You can be underestimated and still create legacy. You don't have to yell to be heard. You don't have to prove anything to people who never wanted to understand you in the first place. And most of all, you don't have to wait for permission to be the person you were always meant to be. I didn't get revenge. I got clarity. And from that clarity, I built a life, quiet, steady, unshakable. So if your family cut you off, rewrote the story, or made you feel small for choosing peace over chaos, what would happen if you stopped trying to win them back and started building something of your own instead? Have you ever had to walk away from the people who raised you to become the person you're meant to be?